introduce you to the many faces of Walter Mitty. We have the original short story written by James Thurber, then the movie adaptation with Danny Kaye in 1947, and finally, the most recent adaptation from 2013 with Ben Stiller. There's a theory I've often heard about adaptations, and a lot of people believe that the first version of a story you encounter, especially with books and their movie adaptations, is going to be the one that you will always love the most. I beg to differ. My first encounter with The Secret Life of Walter Mitty was the 1947 version of the film with Danny Kaye. My family loves classics, and this one was a really fun one. I was incredibly skeptical when I heard that they were doing a remake a couple of years ago, especially because I am not a big Ben Stiller fan. But I had to watch it anyway, because I'm curious. Lastly, I finally went back to the original and dug up Thurber's short story so I could finally see where it all came from. So here we go with the comparisons. With the 1947 version, I adored this film when I first saw it. I was very much like Walter Mitty when I was a youngster, imagining all kinds of exciting and adventurous scenarios for myself. Granted, my imaginings were nowhere near as in-depth as Walter Mitty's. But the idea of someone who's always dreaming of a more interesting and adventurous life suddenly getting thrown into one is just not something I can pass up. There were only a few things that I really didn't like about this film. A lot of them were a direct result of it being a 1947 film because movies were just constructed differently back then. There were no VHS or DVDs, and people didn't get to take home movies at any point. You went to the theater, you saw it, it had a limited run, and that was basically the end. So movies were much different back then. They were a much bigger entertainment factor. It was much more of an event. Stories were not always pared down to their best. They could be a little too long and have a little too much content. Also, they could be used for showcasing an actor rather than focusing on the story. Give them a break. They were still figuring out the medium. Nevertheless, there were at least two scenes that I can think of off the top of my head that did nothing more than to provide a stage for Danny Kaye's comedy. Both took place as one of Mitty's daydreams. One, when Mitty is in a department store, he daydreams about being a famous fashion designer. And the other one is more like a scene within a scene. Mitty is imagining himself as an ace fighter pilot in World War II when, within the daydream, one of his old friends from back home is telling everyone in this bar how he had a brilliant knack for imitating their eccentric music teacher, and so everyone begs him to display this skill, and it's a very long scene. And both of these scenes were very, very long. Very long. And they did nothing to further the story, and so they were kind of painful for me to get through. If I watched it on my own, I would probably fast forward through both of those scenes just because they really don't add anything to the story. As a side note, in the 2013 version, there are also a few of the daydreams that seem to play more to the comedian Ben Stiller rather than to the movie. This would be the epic battle over Stretch Armstrong and the Benjamin Button spoof scene. However, they do still carry on with the story, with the Armstrong scene. It's just another one of many daydreams Mitty has about standing up for himself and putting the bearded jerk exec into his place, and the Button spoof an imagining of a future with his love interest. They were also the standard length of the other daydreams, so not too long and not too terribly painful. For these two reasons, they don't bother me near as much. In the 47 version, Walter Mitty starts out as a small fish in his company, where his ideas are often stolen by his boss. He's a mild-mannered, submissive man who dreams of being a more interesting and even heroic person. His daydreams often include a certain mysterious blonde, and one day, when Walter Mitty runs into this blonde, only to find that she is in the throes of a dangerous conspiracy, he begins to suspect that it's just another one of his daydreams. What I loved most about this movie is that Walter Mitty evolves from a skittish man who lets everyone walk all over him into a more confident man who finally starts standing up for himself. Instead of daydreaming about being an interesting and heroic guy, he actually becomes one. Like I said, I was very skeptical of the 2013 remake when I first heard about it. Much of the original film's detail was very dated, and a lot of it would be considered pretty ludicrous by today's movie standards. Something like that just probably wouldn't go over too well. So I assumed that the story would have to be completely rewritten, and I was right, but I was afraid of what Ben Stiller would do to it. Again, Not a huge Ben Stiller fan. There is no mysterious blonde pursued by murderous jewel thieves, there is no conspiracy, and there are no overbearing mothers. Instead, there is a mild-mannered photo developer who is about to get fired and has one last photo to print. Only the photo has gone missing, and the only person in the world who knows where it is a freelance globe-trotting photographer. In an effort to save his job, Mitty leaves the country for the first time in his life to track down the photograph. Walter Mitty lives in a bleak and colorless life, and 100 million kudos to the people responsible for the beautiful filmography in this movie, because it takes us from bleak and colorless to bright and cheerful, and I loved that. It was a great touch to a really good movie. But anyway, Walter Mitty lives in a bleak and colorless life. He's just getting through life, living one boring day after another. And he often daydreams of something more adventurous and satisfying. Now, at first, I thought the idea of this bleak and colorless office worker suddenly boarding a plane to Iceland in pursuit of an elusive photograph to be rather ridiculous. It seemed very out of character for the individual, and I wasn't really following the story very well. But as the movie goes on, we learn that Mitty was quite a wild and adventurous youth before his father died and he was forced to grow up pretty fast. Once you find out that Mitty's life plans of adventure were derailed by fate, you suddenly understand him a lot better. His daydreams aren't just daydreams. He doesn't just have his head in the clouds. They're longings for a life that he could have had, for the life that he wanted. They're a way for him to keep his sanity while his wild and adventurous self is trapped in the boring life of an office worker. This version felt a lot more grounded in reality to me. Mitty's character was so much more interesting. While the 47 version was more about Mitty learning to stand up for himself and having the chance to become a hero, this version is more about introspection. How life can throw you down, but it's always worth getting back up again. And that it's never too late, even if you get sidetracked. It teaches us to appreciate the little things, the simple beauties in life, wherever we are. It's a feel-good movie down to its core, and it is by far my favorite of all three versions. The short story was actually my least favorite of all of the versions. And it has nothing to do with the fact that I didn't read it before I watched either of the movies. It's the fact that in the short story, Walter Mitty doesn't actually evolve. This story is only about his daydreams in his normal life. And his wife is a shrew. I don't think I have ever disliked a character so fast in such a short span of time. I really, really hated her. Thurber obviously gets kudos for coming up with the original concept. And it is a clever little story. But considering that what I loved best about both versions of the movie was Mitty's development from an unsatisfied man dreaming of a better life to the man who decides to stop daydreaming about a better life and actually pursue one. In the process becoming a more confident and self-assured individual, well, it's really no surprise that the story is my least favorite. In the short story, the closest Walter Mitty gets to standing up for himself is defiantly standing out in the rain, living on the wild side despite the danger of catching a cold. Now you might be thinking, tell the truth, Amanda, it sure sounds like your opinions of the movie colored your opinion of the book. Yes and no. What I loved about the movies was the character development, and it is a big reason why I don't like the story. But I also know that if I had read the story first, I wouldn't have liked it very much. I may just be a book snob, but I like things to happen in a story. I would have been annoyed with the short story as it was, and I probably would have come away thinking that it was rather pointless. The daydreams and the basic idea would have entertained me, but the execution would have irritated me. What I most dislike about the short story is that it makes me pity Mitty. I feel so sorry for him. It brings me down and it makes me feel kind of depressed. This is a complete contradiction to how I feel about Mitty in the movie versions. Because in the films, I'm proud of him. I cheer for him. The movies are uplifting and they make me happy. They make me want to stand up and pursue my life with vigor. A lot of times my reading for a book does come down to that, whether or not it made me happy. Now, one fun thing is how so many of Daydreams are duplicated, almost verbatim, from the short story to the 1947 version of the film. They obviously did their best to keep the roots of the story apparent. Right down to the ever-present tabakada, 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 which actually plays quite a minor role in Mitty's development in that movie. None of the daydreams were mirrored or adapted in the 2013 version, but I think that's okay because I feel like they were really trying to write their own story and they mastered it beautifully. That's it for me. I'll see you all next week.